COVID is starting again in China, and their sinister plan is to infect everyone visiting. Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang. It was just announced today that everyone traveling to China won't need to take a COVID test before arriving. And this may seem like, they're half year behind everybody else when it comes to lifting the COVID restrictions, but the actual plan is more sinister than that, because what they're trying to do is to pin the blames on the new wave of COVID infection in China to those that are traveling to China. But they're not letting you know that, so they're just saying, well, nobody needs to do a COVID test before coming to China now. And they're saying that we're welcoming foreign visitors. And this is all because there's another wave of COVID-19 hitting China. My relatives and friends in China have been telling me for the past week they've been recovering from COVID. And a few months ago, they were positive for COVID. So this is the third time that they've caught it this year. And so you notice something very strange in China, which is the behaviors of the COVID virus inside China and outside of China. It's very different, and it's very prominent today. Now, you might be wondering, why is China trying to pin the blame on foreigners visiting China? Well, they've actually been doing this since the beginning of the pandemic. Remember, in the early days, they've been saying that, Italy or the US is the origin of COVID, or the fact that certain items like frozen seafood products or car parts, anything that they tested positive, they've been trying to use as an excuse to say and pin the blame on those targets rather than themselves, including the seafood market or the Huainan market in Wuhan, rather than looking at their COVID labs. Now, of course, in China, nobody's going to tell you that, at least the officials aren't going to say that another pandemic is starting in China or how many people have died. But that's the reality today, that COVID continues to strike Chinese people. And they, since the early this year, they've not been telling people the truth. They're saying that it's a seasonal flu, it's other types of respiratory viruses, or it's even pneumonia, and they refuse to categorize it as COVID. And something really strange in my talks with my friends is that the people that caught COVID earlier this year, normally you would think that they would now have developed defense against COVID, right? But they've been, for example, in 1 month, they've caught COVID, tested positive, recovered, and then immediately caught COVID again in a very successive episode. But then now they've caught it a third time within the period of 1 month. And so it's very strange. And people are calling this 3 positives in a row. Before, it was just only 2 positives or re-positive, which means that they caught COVID, thought they recovered, but then caught it again. Despite what their propaganda tells you, China never really defeated COVID-19. In fact, you can't really defeat a virus because it simply has no control as a human being toward how the virus develops, right? And we're seeing this now. There's a new COVID subvariant. It's called EG5 or EG.5, and it's codenamed Iris. And this variant is very similar to its other Omicron subvariants, and it has a very high contagion or spread rate. So you get infected really easily, but you're not really much affected by it, right? So you might get light symptoms or no symptoms at all. But here's the interesting part. So ever since this year, people in China have been reporting that they have high fevers, colds, they cough a lot. And in some cases, they even develop something called white lungs. And this has been happening to younger and younger people. Now, you might think it's very different compared to what we experience here in the West, which is that people often, they catch Omicron. Nowadays, you might have had it and you might not even know that you've had it. So why is there such a big discrepancy between the symptoms of people in China versus that of the West? It's something to think about. Now, and according to the Chinese CDC on August 19th, what they've said is that the infection rate of this particular EG.5 has increased from 0.6% back in April to a dominant 71.6% in August. And they say that the trend is likely to continue. Whereas if you look at the data for the United States, it only counts for about 20% of the overall infection rate when it comes to the COVID strains. And this to keep in mind, according to a Yale Medicine report, quote here, it says that this year, in the first week of August, the CDC, that's the US CDC, noted that 14.3% upward trend in COVID-related hospitalization. And when we compare that data to the data that we see in Shanghai, they say it's about 10 to 15%. Do we really believe that only 10 to 15% of hospitalization so far, when that particular strain is the dominant strain in China, right? 70+% of all of the variants in China is now the EG5. And then you also have to consider the fact that if this was the case, we would have to forget all of our past records debunking the CCP For example, over the past 3 years of COVID, they claim that only around 60,000 or so people have died. Of those, directly they say that died from COVID-related causes is only 8,000. Which means that they're considering that all of the other deaths to be non-COVID related or indirectly COVID related. Now, this is very important because what they're doing here is they're playing a word game. They're saying that, oh, COVID didn't kill that many people in China. It only did a few thousands. All the rest of them died not because of COVID. But then when we consider what they're doing here is downplaying the numbers, whereas rest of the world, right, the United States, they're actually upplaying the number or overcounting in most cases. Now, the question still remains, why would they want to blame it on foreign visitors? Because I think, personally, is that the situation in China is getting so dire. There's no way they're going to let it stay in China as it is. And it's also a good opportunity. They're currently hating Japan for releasing the wastewater, so they're just creating another imaginary enemy, one particularly if they are from the United States, perfect, to just pin the blame on those people instead and say that they are the reason why we're now having a new wave of the pandemic after we've eliminated it earlier this year. And another reason is their economy. It's in the worst state possible, and since the reform and opening up era, so there's no reason why they can't also divert attention from that to their other issue, which is the pandemic, right? If you have foreign visitors and you don't test them anymore, but they still brought in the virus, that means they intentionally are trying to kill people in China. But we know this is all their own doing. Over the past 3 years, the draconian lockdowns in China, we saw the devastation and the humanitarian crises it has caused over and over again. But then they suddenly stopped the lockdown. They lifted everything in just one go, right? There's no preparation, no hospital preparation, particularly, and as well as the supply of pharmaceutical or prescription drugs to help with, fever medications or children care. And so all of these things, they suddenly do this like flip-flop. It's what creates a lot of the humanitarian disasters in China. And we saw during the last wave, which was from November on to the earlier days of 2023, was that many videos show crematoriums. There were people lining up to burn bodies of their deceased family members. And that line shows us that the actual number of deaths in China is not as low as they're claiming to be. According to a recent study, about 2 million people have died, where researchers used China's internal search engine, which is called Baidu's data. What they did at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center was they conducted a statistical analysis from public information, and this is using Chinese obituaries and search data from China's internet search engine, Baidu. But the report's figures are likely to be a serious underestimate, which is because given the tight control of data and the manipulation of data in China, they don't really have a tight, firm grasp on what exactly is the scale. And I think that 2 million is a very, very, very conservative estimate. I would say at least 10 times, if not 100 times of that number, 2 million, is the actual casualty from the CCP's policies. Now, Master Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Dafa, in January, Master Li revealed that 400 million have died over the 3 years of COVID in China, and the Chinese regime continues to cover up the actual situation. And he recently pointed out that COVID has started again in China. The CCP virus is directly aimed at the Chinese Communist Party, as well as those who blindly follow the CCP, defend the CCP, and work for the CCP. Many people, including many young people, have died so far. The CCP's cover-up of the entire COVID situation will go down in history as one of the worst most egregious act against humanity overall, because of the devastation we saw, from the cover-up in the initial Wuhan outbreak to now continuing to cover up in China. It has only caused disaster and chaos around the world. And the worst thing about that is the fact that they exported this lockdown authoritarian model around the world, and it was adopted by Western governments because nobody knew what the real situation in China was. And now we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg because people, researchers and investigators are finally looking at the number and the actual death count in China, because they realize that what's happening in China is much different than what was being told initially to the outside world. And China has effectively used this as not the virus itself, but I think the process of as a bioweapon, which they weaponized to destroy the economies, destroy the living systems, and destroy particularly the future of young people around the world, because everybody locked down, nobody went to schools. The entire ability and the production of a particular country shut down. And that was very devastating. They also at the same time launched things like the CCP vaccine diplomacy, which they basically tried to go to a country that was struggling with the COVID situation and try to sell them them vaccines to win their favor. And what they also did was launch a narrative war against the United States. They say that the US was the reason the COVID situation started, as well as other countries like Italy. And then at the same time, we're still now struggling with some of the aspects because of the pandemic. But I think the good thing is now we're finally seeing the circumstantial evidence that suggests that China can't hide much anymore. For the first time this year, they admitted that China's population is on decline. And this is after, like I said, they recategorized many COVID deaths as non-COVID related deaths. In another report by the New York Times, went and asked researchers about the actual death situation in China, they concluded the estimated death is between 1 million to 1.5 million. Again, I think there's 10 to 100 times more death than what is being told by those researchers, because again, you can't access information in China, and a lot of that data is being manipulated. The thing about the Chinese Communist Party is that rather than trying to fake numbers now, in recent days they've decided to just not release numbers. Remember the youth unemployment rate in China, right? Because it got so bad, now they're not releasing that data anymore, and they did the same thing with cremation data back in November. So cremation data can be used as a reference for observing the number of deaths from the pandemic, and then usually the data comes from the Ministry of Civil Affairs in both the central government and many parts of the provincial government. Now, according to the people online that were trying to get the data, they didn't publish the data from the Ministry of Civil Affairs from the central government for the fourth quarter of 2022, right? That was during November to December. And then they also didn't publish for the first quarter of 2023. Just that line just doesn't exist. So they just somehow decided to, rather than faking it, because they know that people don't buy it, they're just saying we're never going to release it. On July 13th this year, the Department of Civil Affairs in one province, the Zhejiang province, they did publish cremation data, and they saw a jump of about 72% over last year, which means that there is a 72% jump from how many people have died last year to this year, just based on cremation data. Of course, this report was subsequently covered by Caixin, one of the leading newspapers in China, but then both the report and the actual data file were deleted soon after. And starting this year, there's been a lot of reports of CCP officials, policemen, professors, government officials, celebrities, basically people that told the party line. This is not the good time to be close to the CCP. Whether, you're somebody that watches the show that is speaking on behalf of the Chinese government, or you're actively getting paid by the Chinese government, I think it's time for you to distance yourself. I mean, look at what happened over the past few decades in China. 2002, they spread the outbreak of the SARS virus spread around the world. And then in 2008, the bird flu also originated from China. 2019, Wuhan outbreak, COVID-19. Right? We're still dealing with the aftermath. And then 2023, now China's economy, they're sending a systemic contagion across the world, and that's going to send shockwaves across the financial system. And yet now they're trying to do, once again, with COVID, for those that are coming back into China. So my word of caution to everyone is you have to stay away from the CCP. Whether you believe this is some sort of a divine intervention, or, just a regular good versus bad principle of humanity, I think it's a good opportunity to reflect on that, because look at what happens with those that are close to the CCP, right? They don't really go anywhere positive, and it's only downfall from there. It honestly tells us that everything bad around the world in recent years have started in China. And I don't think there's anything else that we need to discuss other than stay away from the CCP. All right, that's it today for the episode where we discuss why China is letting go of the last bit of COVID restrictions. And the plan is more sinister than that. If you enjoyed the content, leave a like, comment below your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel today. All right, see you next time. I'm David Zhang. This is China Insider.